Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Let's start with a story that shows not the best relationship between relatives, so sit back and make yourselves comfortable. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. My boss who tried to hit on my wife. The year is 1995. There's me, who I'll name Kevin O'Malley. There's my wife, who we'll call Alice O'Malley. And there's my boss, who we'll call Mark Green, who she never met. Alice and I worked in Seattle for Computer Store. I was 20 and we had 2 kids. I was teaching for them, you name it, Word, WordPerfect, Excel, Quattro, Access, Quark, Photoshop, basically every single thing that existed at that time. Alice was doing inside government sales. We got job offers in Dallas at the corporate HQ. I would be training at the flagship store down the street, and she would be doing major government accounts. Because I was young and hadn't finished a university degree, I had trouble getting certification to teach in Texas. My manager told Mark all about me, but he didn't really pay attention. When I got there, he quickly realized that it wasn't legal for me to teach the public since I didn't have TEA certification. He also decided he'd rather have someone else. However, I was well connected within the company and was friends with people far above him. He tried to drag his feet on my TEA certification as my sponsor. I could get it, I had enough college and work experience, but he was trying to force me to quit. Mark goes to a big convention in LA for government sales as we sold training to the government as well. Alice, being in government, also has to go. The company has gotten rooms for everyone at the same hotel. The first evening, I get a call from my wife. This guy was trying to touch me on the elevator and cornering me. Ew, gross, I say. Well, you're a big girl. Tell him to F off. Knee him in the balls or something. I will if I see him again, she replied. I thought nothing of it. That was that. A few hours later, I get a call from my wife. She seemed pleased with herself. You could hear her smile beaming through the phone. Kevin, she excitedly blurted out. You'll never guess what I did. I'm somewhat perplexed as I'm thinking she's won the lottery or something. What'd you do? You know your manager, Mark? Yes, Alice, of course I know Mark. He's the bane of our effing existence. He's threatening our ability to be able to live. F that guy. What? In the most serious tone I have ever heard out of her, she says, Mark is the guy who was hitting on me. I pause and say, okay, so what happened? Alice says, well, I was at the bar and he comes up to me and I'm sitting there with my name tag having a drink and talking to Karen, my coworker. He comes up and tries touching me, fondling me. I tell him to stop. We were all wearing name tags from the convention, but he wasn't. He looks at mine and says, O'Malley, and starts to pause. She goes on. I ask him what his name is. He says Mark Green. I instantly figure it out. I say to him, don't you know my husband? And he looks kind of dejected. Kevin O'Malley? And his face turns white as a ghost and he leaves. I say to her, go tell Virginia, the training director, right now. Go tell her right now. Virginia is a friend of mine because I created and developed the first internet instruction course for us in 1994, and we marketed it to the entire company. It was really successful and part of the reason I had a name for myself in the company. Alice goes and finds Virginia. She tells him how he kept touching her and hitting on her and didn't take no for an answer, how he was dragging his feet on my TEA certification, how he didn't know who he was hiring and failed to tell us this was even a problem. And Virginia calls me, and I explain all this. Virginia is an old-school feminist and the only female executive. Older lady. She was not impressed. Mark returned early from the conference. My TEA certification happened quickly, as in people from up high in the company pulled strings to get it done. Mark wasn't long for our location. Our store was the flagship. We had the biggest accounts, and it was by far the most prestigious. Before he was moved laterally to a different store with no future, my wife used to call me at work and call his direct line to ask for me. She would pick me up at work and come in with our kids. He would close his door every time she was there. Every time I asked him for something, I got it. And I made it a point to ask him for stupid crap. All the time. And then he left for the crappy store and eventually left the company for good. And our second story. Mess with my wife's job? You both can find a new one. So I'm one of the bosses for a construction company here in Canada. My wife works at a software company now, but at the time, she was working at a small company while finishing her degree. My wife just finished her maternity leave and was ready to go back to work. Well, things didn't go exactly as planned, and her replacement was her supervisor's friend, and together they decided to make her miserable and make her quit so friend could stay on. My wife documented various instances of harassment and general incompetence on both their parts because my wife was more or less her supervisor's assistant and practically did her job for her. That stopped fast, and my wife would say, "That isn't what I was trained for, and it isn't in my job description." Supervisor got PO'd but couldn't do anything about it. My wife also recorded various instances of supervisor and coworker stealing from the company, and she showed all the evidence to her boss's boss's boss, who I'll call level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 looked at it and immediately bumped it up to level 2 because that's what he was told to do. Level 2 was shocked and immediately suspended both supervisor and friend, while also bumping the case up to level 3. Level 3 was in a rage and a huge investigation followed. Both girls were fired and had to deal with legal stuff that I don't know about since I wasn't there. Now you're likely wondering where my revenge comes in. Well, it turns out supervisor's husband works at my job and I had to lay someone off. This guy was an a-hole and always slacked off and harassed coworkers, so it was an easy choice. He flips his crap and begs me to let him stay, and I say to him, "Buddy, you're lucky you lasted this long. I gave you so many chances." I wouldn't have fired him if he wasn't such a screw-up, though. And our last story. So this actually happened to my dad a few years ago. He lived in an area right along the Texas-Oklahoma border in a fairly rural area. My dad primarily worked in pipeline construction. One day, my dad noticed someone had purchased a very large property not too far down the road. Turns out that the new neighbor was actually from the suburbs around Columbus, Ohio, and had just won a lottery prize. The man hadn't won the jackpot, but had won a smaller prize, around $2 million. My dad was also originally from Ohio, so he decided to say hello. A few days later, he meets the Lotto neighbor. We'll call him Jim. Jim starts telling my dad about his dream to build his own self-sustaining homestead far away from the rest of society. Jim was very interested in prepping and convinced of a soon-to-come global societal collapse. He used his Lotto winnings to purchase the land and begin building his homestead. My dad honestly didn't find this that odd because many people in the area had some tendency towards independence, and those prepping shows were popular at the time. About a year later, Jim reached out to my dad to ask for help with a construction project that involves burying a large water tower in the ground. My dad's a little confused, but decided to go take a look. Turns out Jim bought an old water tower about 15 feet in diameter and about 15 feet high for the purpose of reusing it as an underground shelter. Jim had recently completed the build of a prefab home on his property and wanted the water tower buried partially under the new home with a trapdoor built in a closet to access it. My dad immediately thought this was the dumbest thing he'd ever heard and proceeded to tell Jim all the potential issues with his plan. Jim cut him off and told my dad that his contractor for the home had basically told him the same, and so had several others he'd contacted to try to get them to bury this water tower. However, Jim believed this was simply laziness on their part and had the utmost confidence in his plan. My dad left, but a day or so later, Jim contacts him again and asks about paying my dad to let him rent some construction equipment he had on his own property. My dad again goes over with him what a bad idea this is and how no legitimate crew would ever do this for him. Jim brings up using my dad's equipment and illegal laborers. My dad decides, well, if he's determined, might as well make a few bucks off Lotto winner Jim. He quotes him some ridiculous price to rent his equipment and says he can ask a guy at work he knows about gathering up a group of Mexican day laborers. Jim agrees to the crazy price, and my dad gets in touch with a Mexican friend who had a crew of day laborers. A bit later, my dad asks his friend about how the project's going. He tells my dad how nasty Jim treated the workers, how stupid the whole plan is, and how his specifications for how he wanted this built were completely idiotic. Whenever they'd offer up suggestions or point out why something he wanted was wrong, he'd essentially shut them down and use a bunch of slurs for Mexicans. So they buried the water tower and built this secret entrance exactly as he wanted. Knowing it was completely stupid, He mentioned they only completed the job because Jim was paying them way more than they were used to making. Everyone agreed Jim was a jerk, but all the more reason to gouge your prices and take his money. A year or so goes by when my dad gets a frantic call from Jim. It had rained quite a bit, which was unusual for the area, and now the entire ground floor of the back of the home was bowed upward about 2 feet. My dad goes to Jim and takes a look around, realizing what has happened. Given that they'd essentially just buried a large hollow object underneath his home, the rain caused the water tower to be pushed upward and right through his first floor. My dad explained the situation, and Jim immediately lost it, started ranting about how he should never have used those Mexican laborers and how he was going to make them come fix it. My dad mentioned how that was impossible since most of them go back and forth across the border, but Jim was livid. My dad later found out from Jim that his insurance would not cover the damage to his home because he'd buried a water tower under it without telling anyone. He mentioned trying to sue the insurance company, but that went nowhere. He also tried numerous times to find the day laborers, but was told you get what you get when you hire illegal workers to do a project that would never have gotten a permit. Over the months afterward, there was a lot of fallout for Jim, and he couldn't even live in his home due to the damage. It eventually was torn down to be able to remove the water tower from beneath it. He burned through his Lotto winnings pretty fast and didn't have anything left to rebuild it. He ended up selling the land and moving away about a year later. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.